kind we met in John Dewey. I think this is why a professor of mine one time instituted a seminar by saying that to his mind, positivism and pragmatism both amount to the same thing and they're both dead-end streets. You see, because they confine themselves to the limitations of empirical science. Okay, questions? Comments? I think that's very simple and you probably grasp it right away. Okay? John Stuart Mill. I think it's fair to say that Mill is the most empirical of all the empiricists. You mean more than Locke and Hume? Yes. Hume, you see, talked of two kinds of knowledge. Matters of fact, relations of ideas. Relations of ideas are analytic truths, predicate contained in the subject, like mathematics. Mill maintains that mathematics is an empirical science. 3 + 5 = 8 is an empirical generalization about all sets of 3 and 5. So analytic truths then are really empirical generalizations, or if you like, empirical hypotheses. The laws of thought, non-contradiction, identity, A = A and not non-A, empirical generalization about the way in which we think and use language. In other words, what Mill is doing is reducing these first principles to psychological generalizations, that is to say, about how the mind thinks. And this is what Husserl meant by psychologism, which he condemned. Psychologism does not provide an adequate foundation for mathematics, for logic, etc. You're right. Psychologism. So this is the sort of thing that Husserl was fighting against, that we anticipated there. But in this move, Mill is rejecting all intuitive knowledge, all innate knowledge, all self-evident truths. In fact, a considerable portion of his writing on epistemology was written in a work criticizing the philosophy of Sir William Hamilton, who was one of the Scottish realists. And you know, Scottish realists in the tradition of Thomas Reid were talking of self-evident truths. Truths which we naturally, spontaneously come to believe by virtue of proclivities of the human mind built into the human constitution which God created. And what Mill is doing in the spirit of the Enlightenment is saying that's not certain enough, that's not positive enough. These truths are simply empirical generalizations. Empirical hypotheses, if you like. Now, to say that generalizations and self-evident truths are really hypotheses helps you to see how it is that Mill develops the hypothetico-deductive method. But it also helps you to see how he can be an empiricist and talk of the principles on which deduction work as being empirical. A syllogism, you see, not only has to have premises, but it has to have valid inferences, connections in accordance with the laws of logic. But if the laws of logic are empirical generalizations and the premises are empirical generalizations, hypotheses, if you like, then you have really a syllogism as a manipulation of empirical knowledge. Simply that. Inductive reasoning, he recognizes, presupposes the uniformity of nature, principle of induction, uniformity of nature. Mill had pointed that out. Well, according to Mill, the uniformity of nature is simply our broadest empirical hypothesis. You see? It's an empirical generalization extrapolated to everything. All right, that's the hypothesis. And so, a thoroughly empirical procedure. In his work on logic, and Mill did a great deal of writing on logic, he refined Bacon's inductive methods. You remember his table of presence, table of absence, so forth. He refined those. Essentially the same methods really, but a little closer definition in order to render the kind of precision for positive knowledge that he wanted. Now, that then is how he approaches not only natural science, but the science of human nature. So, as I was saying just now, when he asks about the nature of matter, his response is very simply, that matter, that term, has as its meaning, empirical reference, its meaning, simply the permanent possibility of sensation. From an empirical standpoint, the existence of material bodies means that sensations are possible. And by the same token, the existence of mind means the permanent possibility of reflection. Well, you see, he's just building on the John Locke business, simple ideas of sensation, simple ideas of reflection. But discarding Locke's view of the reality of matter as substance, the substratum, and discarding Locke's view of the reality of mind or soul as immaterial substance, the thing that thinks, he's refusing to do metaphysics, refusing to speculate. Notice that this is very close to David Hume, who called mind simply a bundle of perceptions. In fact, I think it's not quite as skeptical as David Hume. You see, when Hume said that all we know of mind is the bundle of perceptions, he was referring to our present perceptions, which include our memories that we think are of the past, anticipations we think are of the future. But for Hume, mind is simply this present bundle of perceptions. Beyond that present experience, we have no knowledge. No knowledge of matters of fact beyond present experience. This bundle of perceptions. Locke, of course, had asserted personal continuity, personal identity through memory, knowing the past, which Hume thinks isn't validated. May be true, we can't prove it. Mill, however, when he says permanent possibility, he's referring to the empirical generalization about matter or mind as being hypotheses. You see, if there is a permanent possibility of sensation, if there is a permanent possibility of reflection, then it's more than simply the present bundle of perceptions. There's personal continuity. At least continuity of conscious. So he's refusing to do metaphysics. You might play with the relationship between this and Jean-Paul Sartre. No transcendental ego. Each new perception taken for me creates the self anew. You see? It's as if he's saying that the self is simply a permanent possibility of new reflections, of new for me experiences. Okay. So what we have is roughly this same outcome in English philosophy in the 19th century that Sartre comes to in continental thought in the 20th century. You see, the dissolution of the self, really, the dissolution of the self. Now, this is why the ethic that Mill develops, his utilitarian ethic, faces problem that is so often hurled at it. The utility principle, of course, says that we should maximize the pleasure, minimize the pain for the maximum number of people. It's saying you should treat people as a collection of painful and pleasurable experiences. But what else can you do with your Mill if the self is just a permanent possibility of experiences? All you can do ethically is to regard the self that way and try to maximize the good experiences. There is no basis in utilitarianism for respect for persons in the Kant tradition, for the simple reason he has no conception of the person beyond simply the bundle of experiences. You see? Justice, human rights, these are words we give to certain useful things which produce the positive experiences. So we value justice for its utility, not because it's right. There is no prior right, because there's no concept of persons with intrinsic rights. This is why John Stuart Mill has to develop a utilitarian theory of punishment, where previously punishment had been viewed in the retributivist sense. Incidentally, retributive punishment is not vengeance, revenge. No, that's a psychological process. Retribution is simply holding a person accountable, holding a person responsible, and as it were, trying to maintain the balance within society, something which doesn't belong to it. It's an attempt in that word at a social balancing of payments. Well, that's a notion which Mill would have no basis for. And so he developed a utilitarian theory of punishment building on Jeremy Bentham's Principles of Morality and Legislation, in which Bentham advocated providing punishment in order to reform the offender, to deter the offender, without holding the offender morally guilty in the classic sense. And so to this day you find really there are two theories of punishment, at least two theories of punishment